Let's make a start, guys. Welcome back. As you know, we have a guest lecturer this evening, Yannick Jacob, and
good German accent, by the way.
we try. What sort of happens every year in July is that Susan and Raoul and myself get together and we pat ourselves on the back of having yet another successful cohort of people, and we kind of go into what went well, what didn't well, and they have copious amounts of food and alcohol and things like that. And then they come up and saying, whom shall we invite? Who would we want to hear? Because in some ways, I have to be honest here, we kind of course think of you, but you don't exist for us at that point yet, because we don't know who you're going to be. So we're always a little bit selfish, and sort of thinking, whom would we like to hear as well? And whom do you think might sort of really work well in the context of something that we feel hasn't got particularly a mainstream voice, but in the context and in the module that's called the coaching context, where we feel that it really, really should be heard, and it's sort of a voice that you really should be exposed to. And Yannick's name came up with that, because he's doing some very, very exciting things and really pushing the boundaries on coaching. So I'm delighted that you could take some time to be with us this evening. So Yannick, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. I wanted to meet you guys. Thanks for that introduction. Very kind.
Very well.
So I came here to give you a bit of an insight into the way, into the way that I work. I come with a lot of stuff, you know, when you have an hour and you come in and you talk about coaching and the context that you're in, you being almost a year into the certificate, it's always difficult to pick what you would actually want to talk about. So I brought me, first and foremost. I think as in coaching, you have a human-human relationship, and there's a lot here and a lot in my bag. I've been teaching at UEL, the University of East London. I've run the coaching masters there for 3 years. I've come in to existentialism through positive psychology, and coaching kind of came later on in that step. I always wanted to work with people in close psychological contact. But I also realized through positive psychology, which I kind of fell into, because there's a science of what's right with people and what's happiness all about. So how could you not be excited about that? And the second master's in the world had just started up at the university I was studying, so I'm like, I'm going to do that then. And in my 20s I was a bit of a drifter, so that was a perfect drift into something that excited me. Then I realized very quickly a lot of positive psychologists are way too positive for my taste. It didn't really acknowledge for me all of the challenges and curveballs and lemons that life throws at you. I wanted to work with people across the spectrum of what they can experience. And I knew that sometimes a very well-functioning CEO has a mental breakdown, and somebody who could be considered as psychotic has days where they see really clear and they can really benefit from some coaching to reach a certain goal or implement a certain behavior change. So I didn't really want to spend all of my time at either of those spectrums. So I'm quite a multi-potentialite or generalist with a portfolio career or whatever you want to call it. So that made sense to me, to work with people across that spectrum. So then I needed to figure out, well, how can I train integratively? So I have elements of coaching and I have elements of therapy. And at the time, now there's a master's at the University of East London run by my friend Nash Shpokovic. But at the time, the closest I got to was a master's in existential coaching. And I'm like, oh, what's that? I knew somebody who was studying existential psychotherapy, and I had a lecture on Sartre very early in my studies, and I don't really remember any of that because I think it was just so beyond my head at the time what was talking about, which is a shame. Because I think existential philosophy shouldn't be complex and difficult to understand. Because what I realized is that it's tangible for everybody because everybody's human. Everybody has had an experience of being human in the world with other people and what that anxiety and those dilemmas and paradoxes feel like, what they look like in behavior when they come out. So I realized, okay, so that's actually something extremely useful to understand people, to understand human beings in their entirety. At the very core, essential level of just being there. You know, Heidegger talks about Dasein. And if you start getting that, you have a basic understanding of all people. So anybody who comes into your coaching room, you can empathize with their human condition because you are also in that human condition. So that was exciting for me because I found a space where I could integrate all of this exciting positive psychology stuff, these interventions and these concepts and goal-finding methods and what is happiness, what are the building blocks, positive emotions, all of these interesting techniques and methods that I could integrate into my coaching. Similarly with NLP techniques or some CBT stuff. It's difficult not to work integratively to some extent when you're working with people. So for me that was exciting. I found something that I could embed all of these exciting bits, but have a solid yet flexible framework to operate from. And that's kind of what I want to present today. I want this to be quite interesting. I want this to be as useful to you guys as possible. So perhaps just let me get a feeling for what's in the room. What are you interested in? I'm not sure if you've had any introduction to what this might be about or whether anything was communicated. I just wanted to know what you would like to know from me. Because I can be quite flexible. I brought a lot of slides and I'll skip probably through a lot of them. But what's most important is that I answer your questions, that you get what you want out of this session. So if you could throw some stuff at me, that would be helpful. Otherwise, I'll just run you through what I have planned.
Just because from my perspective, I haven't really heard of existential coaching, so I'm just kind of really looking forward to having an overview and understanding what this perspective is. So kind of nothing in particular, I guess.
Great, that'll be in there. Anything else?
What strikes me is the fact that you put together positive and existential, because existential is not necessarily positive.
Yes.
So I'm interested in that.
Yes, that's super interesting because like it does have this kind of reputation, right? Of like French existentialists sitting in their cafes, smoking gouloirs and contemplating how we're all gonna die and life is meaningless.
I'm thinking about phenomenology. So it's not about being positive.
Mm-hmm.
It's about being.
Right, exactly. So it's not necessarily, it seems a paradox, but it actually made perfect sense to me. I'm going to say a bit more about that, so thanks. That's hopefully going to come out, and if it doesn't, please challenge me.
I'm very interested in finding out if you can use this approach in executive coaching.
Good, yeah, there's some interesting stuff around existential leadership. Colleague of mine, Monica Henaway, she's just publishing a book this summer about the existential leader. So there's some work being done. And yeah, good, thanks.
So I did post a question on the site.
You did, sorry, what was that?
On the site, I was told to post a question on the site.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I'll bring that up. Good that you
Okay,
remind me.
perfect. Okay, all right. Then.
Are you all aware of that site? Did other people post questions there? You did?
Yeah.
Okay, if it's two, why don't you just ask the question now, and then we can come back to that, because I'd rather not have you on your phones. In big conferences it works quite well. The site was like, it captures questions and you can upload them. So I figured if there's 25 questions, and I have time to get into 3 or 4, it'll be useful to choose the most popular ones. But do you want to just...
Yeah, okay, so if there's no meaning of life, I'd like to know then how coaching is going to help me, or existential coaching is going to help me find the essence of life.
Oh, a simple question like that. I do actually have an answer that raises many questions and might be helpful for that. Cool, thank you.
I think my question was, I was watching the Gloria tapes, and I wanted to know, do you think it's possible to change someone's sort of philosophic core? And my other question was, why is it important to be happy? Why does it matter if we're happy?
Great, brilliant. Okay, great. I think I have that saved up. With what I have planned, they'll all come up. Good. So, who am I? That's me. I have a bunch of other arms as well. I do some mediation work. I do some work in schools. I supervise coaches. I did quite a bit of training and training other coaches. So I work a lot with coaches, I work within organizations with those people who step up into what I call positions of great responsibility. And that doesn't have to be in an organization. It can be somebody who's deciding to have children, or somebody who enters a relationship. Could be any relationship, because any relationship comes with responsibility. So existentially, they're all the same, but it's useful to kind of to work with that. I think I'll leave that there. Happy for you to ask me any more questions around where I'm coming from. I think I gave enough context to kind of give you a sense of where I'm from. So I want to talk a little bit about what matters to people, meaning being part of that, happiness being part of that. Some of the big questions that come into the coaching room, that came into my coaching room, that comes into my coaches' coaching rooms and students' coaching rooms, and I just wanted to check what kind of questions come into your coaching rooms as well, because this is really what excites me, the big questions, the ones behind how can I lose weight or how can I get that promotion. You know, there's big questions that are underlying even the smaller questions, and that's what I'm interested in, and that's what I think makes coaching particularly effective. If you go underneath that surface and look at what are those big questions. Sometimes the big questions just come out, and the client comes and they seek me out as an existential coach, and they say, how can I, well, what's the meaning of my life? I'm not quite sure. I have this feeling of not really knowing where I'm going or why I'm here, or whether this is all real. But most of the time, they come with a presenting issue that seems a lot more simple. So I just want to go through some of those. Give you existentialism in a nutshell. I could talk about it for hours. It can be difficult to grasp because part of it is that it exists in paradoxes. So it can be difficult to understand. If you're familiar with Zen or some Buddhist philosophy as well, a lot of that is taught in paradoxes. And it's difficult to grasp them at the same time, because some things are mutually exclusive and true at the same time. So I'm trying to try to give you an as simple and easy and tangible understanding of what existentialism is about in the context of coaching. Similar with positive psychology. Who's here familiar with positive psychology? Okay, good. Then how you can integrate that in coaching, and particularly how I integrate that in my coaching. So there's a bunch of like methods, tools, processes that can be very interesting. Some of them I very much use and implement into my practice, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an insight into how I work with that kind of stuff, how it could look like in practice. So first of all, what's coaching? And there's quite a range. Does anybody in this room have a sentence or two? I'm not going to ask you, don't need to present right now, but like, just can I have a show of hands if you have a sentence or two that explain what your coaching style is?
It's about empowering people, getting them to be more confident. It's about if someone wants to be promoted, they doesn't know how or why, what can do, so coaching can help you go step by step. Mm-hmm. So empowering people, teaching them, to grow them.
Yeah, there's a lot in there that I would say is spot on. What I found recently is that very surprisingly few people have that one definition of their coaching and be able to deliver it. You know, it's like coaching is da-da-da, and it works for those and it works like that. You know, it's really difficult, but all of us could probably talk a couple of minutes about what coaching is. But then also coaching has a huge range from some is instructional sports coaching and the kind of life gurus who tell you how to be happier in 10 simple steps. And if they call themselves life coaches, they're arguably life coaches because it's not a regulated profession. Not in my books, but in their books, so we can't sue them, so they're life coaches. Tony Robbins says he's a life coach. He's also not in my book of life coaches. But also there's sometimes I sit there in my practice and I'm thinking, surely what I'm doing right now is completely indistinguishable from psychotherapy. In those moments when you're listening and maybe you've listened attentively for 10-20 minutes and not said much, that can be extremely therapeutic, and you don't know where that difference is. So there's some quotes in the literature that coaching is just a different brand name for counseling, so counselors can earn more money. And I can see that at work. And I know some coaches who, I've seen in some of my students, they came in and said, well, this client, and they were recently bereaved, and they'd just been diagnosed with cancer, and I'm wondering what's the best way to coach them. I'm like, wow, so you're considering to work with this client? They're like, oh yeah, of course, because the consultation was really good and they got really good value out of it and they felt a lot more positive afterwards. And it's like, and you've done a lot of ethics in these two terms, I hear. And so this is a really, really important question for any coach to ask themselves, is where is that line, how far can I go? You know, is this still coaching? Is this still okay to work with? If it isn't coaching, would it be okay to work with? Is it valuable? Would that client be better off working with somebody else? So that's important questions, and particularly when you work existentially, because of the nature of the questions that people ask and the nature of the relationship that you're building with somebody. There's big stuff going on, you know, that's potentially go really quite deep. If you hold a space where people can be still and ask themselves those questions that they have distracted themselves from for most of their lives. You know, should that be better done in a therapeutic space on a weekly basis? Or can coaching offer something? Because reality is most people don't really go to see a therapist, but they would be open to the idea of coaching. So perhaps it's better to work with a coach than not to work with anybody at all. And it might just be a great gateway into doing some real work. Because I know when my line is crossed. I know at what point I'm like, well, if we want to keep working on this, I'd refer you to a good colleague of mine, or give you a selection. And if you want to explore that, I recommend you do that weekly for a prolonged period of time and really go on that journey, really deconstruct things, really unpack stuff. So, but like a lot of coaches, the boundary is very vague. So that's something I'm really interested in. And it makes the work so much more complex, so much harder, because it's difficult to know where that line is, and you can't quite describe it beforehand. You can say, here are 10 steps, and this is what we're going to do each session, and we're going to start with exploring your strength, and then we're going to start doing your MBTI, and then we're going to feedback that, and we're going to set some SMART goals, and we're going to brainstorm solutions, and then put them into action with accountability. That's very clear. You can present that, people can buy into that, and they have a degree of certainty what they're going to buy. With existential work, that doesn't work like that. If somebody says, I want to be happier, who knows what that actually means? So you need to start unpacking things there and then. And you can't quite know where that journey is going. And it excites me about the work, but it doesn't make it easier. So I really like this playing field by Dehan, relational coaching, because we can be anywhere on this field when you're coaching. My natural is here, more confronting and exploring, but I can be extremely supportive when the context calls for it. And that's the art of coaching, to know where on this map you're going with a client at any particular moment. And you might switch from one extreme to the other quite suddenly if that's relevant and useful. But it's just a useful way to kind of understand coaching, I think. Because this is not approach-driven. It doesn't matter what kind of approach or what school of thought you're from. You can understand what a coach might do based on this. And not just coaches, by the way. So the big questions. What are some of the big questions that come into your coaching room as you've been practicing coaching? Or to your life? What kind of questions would you bring to a coach?
Can I say something? A lot of people come to you when they are confused. They don't know which way to go.
Mm-hmm.
Like today I had someone, I wasn't coaching someone from work, and he wanted some question, and actually he left more confused because I gave him more suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
It was in terms of work, it wasn't coaching. But sometimes people come to you, they kind of want to know, but when you explore it, they become aware that there's more than one way,
Mm-hmm.
so they get more confusing. Is it that?
Which way should I go?
Yeah.
What shall I do? What's the right thing? Can be something very small,
Which becomes
can be something very big.
And I felt quite bad at the end.
Yeah. What other questions are there?
One thing someone said to me before is, am I normal?
Am I normal?
Yeah. Is that normal?
Yeah, because we want to belong as human beings, we have this innate need to relate with social animals, right? We're hell as other people, Sartre said. We're always comparing ourselves to others. They remind us that we are existentially alone and isolated. But we also have this need, like when we're 13, 14, 15, our first relationships, we want to merge with somebody else and we go to the cinema and we do this today and we think that. But it never works. You know, even if you are married for 70 years and you feel you can know what your partner is thinking, you know, sometimes you have absolutely no idea what's going on in their head. And how could you? So yes, how do I belong? You know, what's my tribe? Who are my people? How can I fit in? What does it mean? It's the natural. What does it all mean? Don't mean shit. I'll put that later. There's other questions, you know. Do you rather like the truth? Do you recognize this from the Matrix? So the red pill is the one that wakes you up, and the blue one is the one that sends you back. You forget about everything and you keep living your illusion. You know, is this real? Do you want to wake up? If the reality was painful and uncomfortable, would you want to? And then there's these mundane choices. Or the other two pills. You know, and sometimes people despair over a choice like that. You know, do I have the sandwich for lunch or the noodles? It's difficult to make that decision sometimes. Or I like a sock analogy. Where, like, am I going to wear the business socks, the grey business socks, or the funky, colorful ones? Because you might meet, if you wear the funky ones, you might meet the love of your life, and the conversation starts with, "Oh, funky socks, who are you?" But maybe you're going to miss out on the career opportunity of your life because the guy's like, this person would be perfect, but like with this kind of sock style, I'm not sure if they're a good fit for our company. You never know. The thing is, you'll never find out, no matter what choice you make. You don't know. So that's part of the existential despair. But like, some of those questions are there. The smallest decisions, which new phone to buy, can lead to despair because you'll never find out whether maybe Apple or maybe Android would have been the better choice. You can still switch later, but it's not the same. Move on. I'll send you that video later, it's cool. So, what do you want most in life? What do you wish for most for your loved ones, for those who might not want to be so selfish? These are good questions to ask yourself, figuring out what most matters to you. If you write down a list of aspects that you couldn't or you wouldn't want to live without, you know, the things that you would do anything to protect. This gives you closer to what matters to you, to what matters in life. And having done that quite a lot, having read quite a lot about it, having worked with many clients, what I realized, there's three groups of these kind of questions. There's questions about existence. If we don't exist, then we're dead, and that's pretty important to people in their life. That's a very essential thing. Questions around, well, why am I here? What does it mean to be alive and in the world with other people? Who am I? What's the point? Is this real? What happens after we die? Autonomy is important to people. Freedom, agency. It's one of the most difficult, like the highest punishments that we have is put people into prison, take all of their autonomy away. The only thing that goes beyond is taking their existence away. But if we take their autonomy away, that's pretty bad. So, how can I be free in a world full of restrictions? You know, how do I make the right choices? Which path to choose? How do I balance what I want versus what others expect? What are the things we can change and the things we can't change? And how can I tell the difference? It will sound familiar to you from a range of different religions. But these are important questions that people ask themselves, especially in coaching. Because it's all about agency and autonomy and helping people to make choices and to move forward in a way that they want. And happiness is the big one. Ultimately, in my experience, I have never had a client where I couldn't connect their goal to some form of happiness, some form of feeling good or better. So if you look at positive psychology understanding of what happiness consists of, some of those well-being theories, they list things like autonomy, like competence, or sometimes called environmental mastery, having the kind of skills to deal with whatever environment you're in. Positive relationships are in there. A sense of self-acceptance, a sense of personal growth. That doesn't necessarily mean earning more money. It can also mean earning less money and doing things that are more meaningful to you. It's a sense of growth, of development, of change. And a sense of meaning and purpose in your life. Sense of achievement. Good health is part of happiness. So all of these things can be connected to anything that a client brings into the coaching room. So early in my coaching journey, when somebody comes to me and I ask them, well, why are you here for, basically? You know, what do you want to use this space for? Why did you come to coaching? Then they're going to tell me something, and I'll try to dig a little bit deeper. You know, in a way, it could be classic role model stuff. You spend some time on the goal and explore where it is. Because if coaching is going from A to B, then sometimes that B is not really the real, that's a presenting issue. Sometimes the real B is up here. And then maybe you don't need to break through this huge barrier. Maybe you can just take the direct way to what actually matters. Maybe you don't need to lose the weight in order to like yourself. You know, maybe you don't need to do X in order to be liked by person B. So in that sense, it opens up possibilities. And for me, coaching is all about opening up new pathways to get what you want. But sometimes you need to figure out first what you actually really want. And you might have told yourself it's something different. So these 3 questions, or 3 areas of questions, are really important. And for me, it was very clear at some point, happiness, questions around happiness, the science of positive psychology is dealing with that. You know, it's exploring what elements are there in happiness, what's right with people, how can we live a good life, a meaningful life, something that is enjoyable. Existentialism deals with questions around being, ontology, existence. You know, all those big questions around once we're still and we're not distracting ourselves, these eerie feelings come up and you start questioning things that are really difficult to explore. And rather than filling the void with either substances or distractions or, you know, meaningless relationships or work, you know, maybe it's good to sit in that for a little bit and appreciate your human condition and feel it, because it feels human. If we didn't have any challenges, life would be really boring. You know, if we didn't, excitement is nervousness. If you're nervous about something, you're excited about it. Just one sounds negative and the other one sounds positive. It's the same kind of emotion, really. And coaching is about agency. So for me, it made sense to put these kind of things together. In a nutshell, this is a philosophy. Philosophy is a method of trying to create knowledge around things that we can't measure or observe. You know, it's a method of inquiry that helps you figure something out that is abstract. So if we ask what's the nature of being alive and what's the relationship between me and the world, you know, you can't really use the scientific method. So philosophers were there before we could measure things to help us understand stuff. You know, science kind of took over as measurement tools were becoming more and more sophisticated. But the existential philosophers have asked themselves, well, what does it mean to be? And exploring what the human condition is about. You know, if we strip everything away, I do this exercise sometimes that you write I am, and you leave a blank, and you write that 20 times, and then you fill in the blanks. And you might say, I am a man, or I am German, or I am humorous, or, you know, I am rich, or I am married. And then one by one, you strip all of these things away. What if I wasn't humorous because I moved to a different culture and they don't get my sense of humor? You know, what if I didn't have that? What if I wasn't married? What if I didn't have that job? What if I didn't have that car? What if I weren't healthy? You know, I am alive is a bit difficult to strip away because it kind of takes away the question around being, because you would be non-being. But you start to get closer to an experience of what it means to just be, rather than being something. Sartre said existence precedes essence. Right? Essence means all of the things that we categorize us with, all the labels we put ourselves. So, existence is before that. First and foremost, we are. I am, therefore I think. But we are first. So the idea is that we explore what's the consequences of that human condition. What does that do to us? So, for example, there's always anxiety, death. Well, maybe let's talk you through this. So there's 4 that the existential philosophers agree on. There's few things that existential philosophers agree on. There is no one school of thought. There is no thought leader. There is no Freud. There is no person who's in charge of everything and everybody. Like there are a few people that have wrote about it first. Yannick Jacob is one of those who wrote first about this kind of quest. But really, what they agree on is the elements of the human condition, which is death, or rather endings, temporality. So if we use the philosophical method to kind of break the human condition down, what we can know is everything ends. Death being the ultimate ending. And there's a paradox, because it's such a great motivator, it gives meaning to our life. If things wouldn't end, then right now would be meaningless. Why do things today if you have an infinity to do it? Okay, there could be some answers to that, but the idea is that death is a thing about human beings. Being challenged a little bit by the exponential development of nanotech and biotech, because it's not so unrealistic anymore to think that we might be able to stop the human body from decaying. So interesting stuff happens to existential philosophy as you start to explore those questions. But in 19th century, and still now, we can assume that everything ends. Everything is going to die. Everything is going to cease to exist. And it's not nice to think about that. But at the same time, people who have a near-death experience, they change their lives in very positive ways very often. They work less and spend time with their family, or they start writing their book, or they tell that person that they love them, which they didn't have the courage to. Things change when you have a sense of ending. Sometimes I do that in coaching sessions. I say, we have 20 minutes left now. Just see what comes up. Because it's a reminder of endings. And I have had that a lot, and you might know that a client, just before the session ends, says something very, very significant, something very important, that you wish they would have brought up a lot earlier. And that's a reminder of endings. Endings do stuff to us, it's useful. But it's difficult to think about them, so there's a paradox there. Freedom, we get to make choices, but we also have to make choices. So, Sartre again says we are condemned to choose. We're ultimately free, but that's also a curse. I had a client who sold his company for he built it over 20 years, sold it for many, many zeros after that number in the front, and then took his whole family to paradise and lived in the Bahamas. And it didn't take 6 weeks, he said, and he couldn't bear the freedom. And you have that a lot. It's since the internet changed everything in terms of freedom, all of a sudden you could be anything that you wanted to, and the kind of Tony Robbins philosophy of you can be anything, you can create yourself in any way you want. Well, what are you going to choose? Because every choice excludes other possibilities. Every pathway you take, every decision you make excludes a bunch of others. Every partner you choose excludes all the others if you're in a monogamous relationship. At least for the time being. If you choose this career, not that. If you choose to study 3 years of this and not the other. If you choose the pasta and not the sandwich. Because it's not about the money, but maybe you're just full and the sandwich would be a very different experience to it. But that's why choices cause anxiety. Same with isolation, we mentioned that earlier. We want to belong, but we want to also be individuals in ourselves. And we're meaning-making machines. We always make sense of things. It's one of the most difficult things for human beings not to be able to understand something. Like, why did that person leave me? And some people spend 3 decades to figure out, why their partner left them, or why that experiment didn't work, or how a certain system works out. How many scientists have dedicated their lives to a question? Finding an answer, trying to figure something out. We do that quite naturally. You give somebody something and we make sense of things. For example, there we go. What's that? Can you recognize it? Nobody?
Cerebrus.
Hey! Yeah, you have very little information on that. You kind of want to know. Same thing here. There's no triangle in there. But we make sense of it immediately. That's not a face. Picture that. Who pictured a man? What do you think happens next?
Calls a cab.
Huh?
Calls a cab.
That's funny in the context of what I know. A father and a son were in a car accident. The father died, and the son gets rushed into hospital. And the surgeon comes, takes a look, and says, "I can't operate on him. That's my son." To some, this will be immediately obvious. To me, it took a painfully long time. That's right. Picture a fireman, and most people picture a man. Look at them. That's interesting. Yes. There we go. Where was it? There we go. Oh, hey. Okay. So we are on a quest for meaning. We are meaning-making machines in an existence where we can't know whether there is a meaning of life. If there was a meaning of life, an overarching sense of what we're here for and what our purpose is as a species or as an individual, we wouldn't be able to grasp it. You know, we can't know for certain. We can believe it. We can choose to believe it, or we can have it inscribed into our being through the way that we grew up. An unshakable belief that, yes, my life does matter. But if somebody were to question you, at some point you're going to run out of certainty, other than an experience of feeling. And in a coaching room, I don't want to question that kind of certainty if somebody brings it. You know, it's a great source of energy. But if you explore the question of a meaning of life overarching for everybody, universal, philosophically, you arrive at a conclusion like the existentialists do. Well, we can't know. But we can create meaning in our lives and choose to believe that that's meaningful based on an experience of that feeling good, feeling meaningful, even if it doesn't feel good. Sometimes you do something, it's not particularly pleasant, but at the end of the night you go to bed and you know you've done something good. But that's mostly experiential. And rationally, philosophically, it doesn't really hold up. You can choose that that matters or not. So, the positive in that you were asking about. For me, I'm always coming at this. You can despair. You can think, well, why does anything I do matter? In a billion years, in a different galaxy, nobody's going to remember what I have thought or done. Even if I caused World War III, it wouldn't matter if we zoom out long enough. You know, even if we somehow get the Earth to change course and crash into another planet, nobody's going to remember in a gazillion trillion years. I don't know. So you can despair at that thought. But you could also say, hey, I'm coming from a positive psychology angle, so I'm thinking, this is extremely liberating. If there are no rules, other than the ones that I create or accept, then I can do whatever I want. And feel good about it. I could say, look, I just don't believe this is real. I'm going to rob that bank and try to make it to Hawaii. And if I choose that to be meaningful, then like you can try to stop me, and you probably will, and I might spend the rest of my life in prison. But nobody stops me from choosing to try that. I'm free to do that. You know, you can choose to do anything that you want, as long as you're dealing with the consequences, as long as you're willing to deal with the consequences of your actions. And that's a positive existential philosophy that I can get absolutely behind with. Some things are absolutely no-brainers to do. But like, I still could choose otherwise. I hear so many have-tos in coaching, and I ought to, and I must. Really? Who says who? Says your value or belief system, or the messages you get from your parents, or the media, or from your supervisor, you know? I can't tell that coach not to work with somebody who's recently bereaved and got their cancer diagnosis. I might have questions around whether that's the best thing for the client. But I can't stop them to do that if they really feel that that's useful, and they have considered it and looked at it from a couple of different angles and talked to their client about it and contracted how they're going to work together, and both decided that that's useful. I can disagree whatever I want. If they both decide that's useful, then they can do that, and I can try to stop them, but they can still choose to do that. And I think there's an excitement in that ability to choose, and in that encouragement to choose, but also anxiety that you're going to have to make these choices. Imagine how many choices you make in a single coaching session. Whether to say something or not to say something. And if you choose to say something, what to say and how to say it. And in the question of how to say it, how fast, how quick, tonality, with body language, are you going to use words or communication otherwise? There's a million different choices you make during a coaching session. And if you were to really appreciate the extent of the responsibility that lies in them, you might go mad, as some existential philosophers in fact did. So this stuff can really eat at you, but it's also a source of great liberation. And that's one of those paradoxes. You're holding these paradoxes. All of these paradoxes, having these like, I want to belong, but I also want to be myself. Endings are motivating, but I also don't want to think about them. These cause anxiety. So anxiety, suffering, is part of the human condition. We can't make that go away, unless we distract ourselves. A couple of like responsibility, change, purpose, direction, temporality, absurdity. I hear a lot of organizational absurdity, things that just don't make sense. How do we deal with that? Really good stuff. Positive psychology. I don't want to say on the other hand, but like, yeah, I guess we could say that. It's a science. It's not new ideas. Aristotle has thought about well-being and happiness and what that means. But what positive psychologists added was empirical data on these existing ideas. Using the scientific method to figure some of these things out. What's good with people, what's right with people, what are our resources, what does well-being consist of. Interventions came out of these scientific findings. Having a language to understand what well-being is and how can we work with it. If somebody says, I want to be happy, I have a language to explore that. I could also use their language, but sometimes it's useful to have these scientific concepts to get curious about what they're not saying. So if I know that, for example, autonomy is a key factor in psychological well-being and happiness, then I haven't really gotten a sense for their sense of autonomy. I can ask curious questions about it. Not saying if they're not mentioning it, they don't really care about it. But that's useful. Post-traumatic growth, positive emotions, what are they actually good for? Character strengths. Is there more? There is, for example, love, hope, mindfulness. So a lot of meditation has been looked at in a scientific way through positive psychology. People at their best, generally. And that's really helpful.
Do you go along with that Nietzsche quote about that which does not destroy us makes us stronger?
Mm-hmm. And Frankl said it as well. I think it depends on context, but yes, absolutely. Depending on how you deal with it. And this is where coaching and psychotherapy or any kind of talking and processing help. If somebody went through adversity, we know now, we have good evidence through post-traumatic growth research, is that a lot of people grow from an experience. You know, if you look at if something really bad happens, if this is time and this is well-being, then you're perhaps at a 7 in well-being, and all of a sudden you get a criticism by somebody, or you fail an exam, or maybe a plane crashes into the World Trade Center where you used to work yesterday, and you're trying to make sense of this new reality. Generally, if you go back here, that's post-traumatic stress. If you do nothing, probably most people, they go back to normal. Resilience would mean you bounce back very quickly. And post-traumatic growth would mean you go beyond where you were before, because you have a new appreciation for life, or for what you had before, a new gratitude, a more solid, yet flexible worldview to make sense of the world. Better relationships. Very often adversity helps us to figure out who our friends are, who really cares about us. So there's lots of good stuff that can come out of it. Doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who's just went through a really difficult experience, to just tell them, look, you're going to be better afterwards. But it's a process that can inform the way that we coach or the way that we work in a therapy room. So there's all these exciting areas of research that can inform the way that we practice. I'll skip those definitions, you can look at afterwards. I'm happy to send you the slides. It is about science, it's about using the scientific method, it's about informing what optimal human functioning is, and it's about finding out how we can increase the flourishing of individuals and communities. So why I use it in coaching? If you induce positive emotions, it broadens and builds people's action thought repertoires. That means they're more creative. They're better able to think about solutions. So you could crack a strategic joke in the beginning, or ask somebody about something that has gone really well in the last 24 hours. You could inquire about, when was a time when you were truly happy? Because you're going to hear what their strengths are and what their values are, but you also start the session incredibly positive. Even if they come with a problem, you can invite them as part of your assessment method, just to create a good positive atmosphere and to inquire about what's right with them. It has a lot of positive effects on the coaching relationship and how people engage in it. It gives you credibility through science. Many positive psychology coaches enjoy that credibility of being evidence-based, even though I think the term evidence-based has somewhat lost its meaning, because somebody tells me, oh no, there's like 2 case studies and that's evidence, and hence it's evidence-based. Or I've used it with 10 clients and it always worked, so I've got evidence that this worked. This is the kind of scientific evidence, empirical evidence that we're talking about. And the scientific process done well is really, really helpful in producing good knowledge, solid knowledge. If we're developing a critical mindset, don't just swallow everything that the media tells you about positive psychology and science has found out that. Because very often it's gone through 3 or 4 filters. And actually more often than I'd like to believe, it's bad science at the very source. It's scientists who got funded from dubious sources, or it's people who just really wanted to find something out, because we all have our biases. As coaches, we all have our assumptions, and we're coming from a certain perspective, and it's important to reflect on that as scientists, also as coaches. And ultimately, what people want is some form of happiness, so this really goes hand in hand. They're natural allies, positive psychology and coaching, just because of the nature of the research, and because coaching can be the applied arm of all of that knowledge. Not just in the coaching room, but using coaching skills in corporations, using coaching skills in teaching or in communities and parenting. It's really useful stuff. So putting them together, for me, means developing existential intelligence. I won't get too much into what that means, but like having an appreciation, not just an understanding of the human condition, but learn to embrace it as the stuff that makes life worth living. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but that's also what makes you human. And the stories we tell our kids and the people when we're older, like the big stories of our lives, they usually involve a degree of challenge that we have overcome. So now when I feel challenged, and I'd rather avoid it, I'll try to embrace it and go forward anyway and feel it. Because there's people who kind of live like that, and there's people who live like this. And I used to be like, nobody should live like that, but actually that's okay, that's a choice that they make. I know some people, some of my friends have spent the last 20 years playing computer games and they still do that. And they have their job in IT and it's safe and they're not really going anywhere, but they don't really want to go anywhere. I have a feeling that maybe at some point that there might be something and they're like, well, I don't want to look back on life and feel I wanted to experience that, which means necessarily you have to experience down here as well. It's very difficult to stay there. I don't want to look back and say, I wanted to experience these things, but actually I was too comfortable here. So now, in my coaching, sometimes I meet somebody who considers they want this, and then they realize, oh, that also includes that. Any success will include risks, and you might be falling, and you probably will. So then you can choose whether you keep doing this and consciously chose it, so in 60 years when you look back, you don't regret it. But if you choose to experience that, you necessarily also need to embrace that. These are the dialectics of human existence. And that creates energy, plus and minus. We always have two poles, yin and yang. In most philosophies, there's an appreciation that life has two sides of the coin. And you can't have one without the other. So in that kind of coaching approach, you allow clients to go deep enough to develop that kind of existential intelligence, to have the courage to look in the existential void, to perhaps not distract them. And you will all have experienced that in a coaching session where there was a really uncomfortable silence and they're asking themselves that question and it becomes quite uncomfortable and you want to kind of rescue them and say something that is supportive or encouraging or comforting. And it's very tempting to comfort our clients. The existential practitioner would help the client sit in that for a little bit and see what it's like to be human. And then make a courageous choice to keep being human. And decide what you want to do with your life. Do you want to live fairly flat or do you want to go to the extremes or anything in between? I can't tell anybody how they should live their lives. And I sometimes notice myself, I still kind of look down on people who kind of don't really experience life in its full form. But that's okay. I don't have to live like that. I can make the most out of it. And that's why I travel a lot around and that's why I'm freelancing, which is kind of stupid if you want to avoid anxiety. Why would you found a startup company in Silicon Valley if you want to live comfortably? Nobody does that. If you want to live comfortably, you take a safe job and you study something safe. In the end, it's never really safe because it's life. But that's existential intelligence. Learn to realize what you're getting yourself into just by being alive. There's this guy who sues his parents for having given birth to him. This antinatalist. Very, very interesting story. But I can see his argument philosophically, because it's suffering, life is difficult, it's really tough, and even if you're really well off, it's still tough, and still suffering, and we're trying to avoid it, which I don't think is particularly healthy. So it's developing that existential intelligence and combining it with positive psychology. So adding science into the philosophy, knowing what people, being able to explore with people what they mean when they say, I want to be happier. Having an insight into what those building blocks might be. Perhaps having an assessment method to get a grasp for how satisfied people are with their sense of autonomy and relatedness and competence and self-acceptance and growth and meaning and achievement and health and all of these elements that contribute to well-being, which we now know. So I have a questionnaire which I now use as part of my practice. I thought it was going to be... there we go. That's what I use when I work with coaches, but here's what I use with, just to have a snapshot over your life in numbers. Autonomy is there, competence, relationships, meaning, purpose, personal growth, self-acceptance. So these are all the well-being theories. Then I added a lot of other stuff in that I knew from science and some that I knew from experience. And like I said, I'm happy to send that to you, but just so you get an overview of how positive psychology could influence and inform your practice. There's other well-being scales. There's a bunch of them, depending on the concept and the particular theory that you're following. You could do a strength assessment in the beginning. You know, in companies very often they do a 360 and then they feedback on the results. It's all grist for the mill, as Jalom said. It's all a good entry into a conversation. So, for me, adding this kind of positive psychology and these ideas from science into that existential coaching space is really useful. So for me, first and foremost, that's the quote I was talking about. Lacan at some point said, there are no formulas, no recipes for the analytic encounter. I don't think there's any formulas or recipes for the human encounter. You know, first and foremost, you're in a space with another human being. That's the existential attitude. First and foremost, you're being with. Very often coaching is seen as doing with. You know, let's facilitate somebody through a process of setting goals and help them brainstorm ideas and reach a goal and change your behavior. First and foremost, you're being human and they're being human. So that's you and that's your client, and you have your worldview and your beliefs and your values, and they have their worldview and their beliefs and their values, and some points they're aligned, and at some points they horribly clash. And in that space, that's where coaching happens. So first and foremost, you need to relate to another human being as a human being. Then the coach comes in, then the essence comes in. Existence is first. So that's why existentialism is a humanism. You know, first and foremost we relate, we create that human space, then we can start doing something with the client. And in that sense, who you are is how you coach, is what I often say. You know, it's important that you have your style and you know who you are and what you believe in. If you have 40 years of teaching experience and you've always given advice to everybody, it's going to be difficult to let that go. Maybe that's not the kind of coach you want to be. Maybe you are going to be a coach who occasionally gives advice, perhaps even a lot, depending whether that's useful. For me, the question is, explain to a prospect, explain to a client who wants to work with you what your style is, what your approach is, and then get informed consent, whether they want to work with you on that basis. So who you are is how you coach. Insight quickly into my... Oh, right, so I should stop soon. That's good. I put a few notes together on my coaching process, which was more difficult because it's a different process every time I meet somebody because of this human thing. You know, some people think much more visually and other people are very heady. It's going to be a different process depending on what they need at that moment. So I would first review what I know, either through the notes if it's an existing client, or through assumptions I have about this client after they've reached out. Notice the assumptions you make about somebody's name, or somebody's profile pic on Facebook, or somebody's language in an email. I use mindfulness now before every session, at least a minute or two, just to kind of ground myself. Meeting that person as a human being, bracketing my assumptions, and then drawing on whatever, you want to contract and setting the agenda for either the session or the relationship. You co-create the space with the client. And then I draw on whatever processes or methods or tools or techniques are in my bag and seem appropriate and useful. And that might be very different. Like with somebody, I role-played a sales conversation, and then the following session we had a deep exploration of who they are being as a coach and their relationship with their father and how it influenced how they coach people. So, as long as that's contracted and as long as you make it clear what you're going to be working on, at that moment I'm giving advice. I know I'm not coaching as far as I'm concerned. But I often contract beyond the coaching boundary, if that's appropriate, if that's what they want. Or if it comes up, we might recontract. If I were to put on my mentoring hat for a second, or if I were to put on my, well, I couldn't say my therapist hat because I don't have official training, but about 60-70% of my literature in the MA in Existential Coaching was psychotherapy. So I feel more comfortable at a space of depth than perhaps many other coaches. So we can recontract whether we want to go into depth on this particular topic, or what would be of best value to that client at that stage. So the main methods are using the here and now. What's happening between us right here is usually a representation of what happens between them and the rest of the world as well. If I feel myself getting angry or annoyed or bored, it's probably really useful for me to be aware of that and think about or bring it onto the table what happened in that relationship right now that I'm feeling that way. If I feel intimidated by how a client talks to me, it's probably useful to put that on the table. So you can have a conversation about how you relate to each other, because chances are they relate to other people in similar ways. It's interesting what just happened here between us. You know, it's usually representative of other things. If you see a pattern, it's really useful to put that out there. So using the here and now is so rich, because they can't refuse it. And it's so real, and it's not distorted by how they tell the story of something that has happened. And phenomenological inquiry, which means bracketing all of your assumptions, being very aware of what your assumptions are, and then really tuning in to the phenomenon that they're describing. So that's the main methods, really. And sometimes I don't do anything else. Other times I bring in any structured tools or interventions. Some clients I give homework when that seems useful, when they would like to. Sometimes I do psychometric tests, not just to monitor progress, but also to unlock a conversation that maybe otherwise we wouldn't have had. So it depends. In organizations, I work a lot more with psychometrics than I would in my existential life coaching work. So it depends. Evaluating progress, taking stock is important, and contracting or recontracting, exiting, that ending existentially is important. You know, I used to work open-ended with a lot of people. I still do sometimes, but I've noticed it's effective to have an ending, even if then you contract more sessions. Existentially, that ending is a reminder that we don't have all life to sort this out. And I realized that sometimes a 45-minute session, as much happened as in a 3-hour session. Just because they knew it was going to be 45 minutes only, and we only have that today, and then we're not going to see each other for a month. Shall we leave it at this point for questions? Or, yeah? So what do you make of that? What do you think of that? Do you have any questions about my process or the way I relate? Let's talk.
I'd like to know how has your process evolved from when you first started coaching and then you put on all these layers of knowledge and training? How did it evolve? How did it start?
That's very cool that you ask. You're not a stooge, are you? My coaching process in 2011. As I said, I came through positive psychology, so I had all of these tools in my bag. And I've heard about coaching through some of those lectures, but I really wanted to dive in. Then I had an overview over a bunch of different coaching approaches and always an existential lens on it. So I put the two together naturally during my masters. And I would still start with the context. You start talking to somebody, they give you a bit of context of why they're there for, which also includes who they are. So that's quite a natural transition into who are they, which means if I hear somebody talk, I tend to listen to their values and their beliefs. They're always in the client's narrative. The way that they talk about people, you could talk about anything, literally, and you start hearing what's important to them, and what their views are on certain topics, and how they relate to other people, and how they relate to themselves. I love extroverts because you hear them think out loud. You know, when you have an introvert in that, if you could put it in those crude categories, you're gonna have to ask for their thoughts. If you hear somebody's thoughts, it makes the coaching so much easier. So you start listening to this underlying stuff, and I put it in brackets because one of the people I studied with, he would get furious about the term. There is no underlying stuff, it's all out there in the open, and I know what he means, but you try to listen to what's underneath the surface. You could also ask specific questions. There's very specific questions that you could ask to reveal somebody's dimensions of existence, how they relate to the social world, how they relate to their body and their physical environment, how they relate to their personal world, their thoughts, their memories, what's going on in their minds, and their spiritual world. What's their belief system and their faith. Atheist is also just a belief system. It's the belief that there is no God rather than the belief that there is one, or many. So, for that I could use assessments and psychometrics. Strength finders are really useful in positive psychology because they're directly related to somebody's values. So the strength research by Peterson and Seligman, it qualitatively analyzed important texts of all cultures they could find. It's a 2-year process, that research. It's a huge piece of research. What they've done is they extracted themes and based 24 character strengths around 6 virtues. I have a slide, I'm not going to try to skip to it at the moment, but I'll send you that anyway. So our character strengths, the things that energize us, the things that we are naturally good at, the talents that we invest time in to then become really good at them, that makes us happy. If you do something you're naturally good at, that's going to be a really enjoyable experience. And they're directly related to what's important to us, what our beliefs and our values are. So we can explore that through these assessments. We can also just have a conversation and really listen quite well. But some of those tools, they help, so I used quite a few of those when I started out. Dilemma and conflict is always something. I would try to pinpoint what somebody's main dilemma is. In terms of, some people struggle more with their relationship to endings. Other people struggle more with their relationship to relate to isolation and how they relate to other people. For some people, they really struggle to make meaning of their existence or which path to take. So very often there is a dominant kind of dilemma and conflict within a certain client. And I would try to explore that a little bit, because often it can focus people's lives. So then we would do some classic grow in between. What's your goal? What's your need? What do you want? What are you trying to achieve, or what are you trying to avoid? And you can use those conceptualizations of happiness to figure out, what is that real be? What do you really want? Which element of happiness are you chasing with, money is means to an end. It's always means to an end. It's always good for something. People want to take the money and do something with it, or feel something because of it. So if you figure that out, you potentially save a lot of time in coaching, working on what's really meaningful to them. And then the classic coaching kind of brainstorming possibilities and choice, looking at what the challenges and obstacles are. I would want to make it fun, so I bring a positive vibe because I know people brainstorm better with positive emotions. Maybe use some interventions, some of this homework kind of stuff. If they come to me with a happiness goal, there's some things that we can do very practically. Get into a gratitude habit, writing 3 good things, writing a letter to somebody that you've never really truly thanked, and going to read it out to them. Maybe get into some meditation, mindfulness, exercise, sleep, diet. All of those bits that seem so simple, but a lot of people just don't do them. If somebody feels very distracted all the time, they're struggling to focus, I would always be curious of whether they have a relationship to meditation or some meditative practice. And it's interesting that many people say, I've tried meditation, it doesn't work for me. Nobody's ever said that about dating. Everybody has had a bad date. Many had many. Some had bad dates that lasted for years or decades, and then they went horribly wrong. They're not going to stop dating. I mean, some do because they don't want to engage in that anymore. They don't want to get hurt. But they know, if they're really honest, that there's going to be somebody that they could probably spend their life with that would enrich it. Also make it more complex. But generally people don't stop dating because of one bad date. And I've known so many people that tried one form of meditation and then said, that's not for me. So it's a shame, because I think that's one of the best skills that we can ever learn, is to be in charge of where our attention goes. It's a very Western idea or understanding of what meditation is. But part of it is a skill that we learn. To sit there and watch our thoughts and our emotions and what's coming into the senses. That mindfulness is a really good way to start training your mind to be in control over where that attention goes. And then noticing it. The more we notice it, the more we are in charge of what we turn to. You know, if somebody wants to be less distracted, that's a good way to get there.
You said a Western idea of meditation. I'm intrigued. What other ideas?
Well, what I mean is it's a very Western idea to say we do meditation to achieve something. That a Buddhist monk would laugh you out of the room. Because meditation is really not about that. It's about being. There is no point to it. You're just being. So saying that meditation is a really useful way to be more productive at work is like, meditation skills can really help you focus better. But like ultimately, meditation is not really in order to do something. Yeah.
So the sort of idea that human existence contains this anxiety and these paradoxes, a lot of people are trying to distract themselves. I completely support that, but how does that serve when someone comes to you for help and you're coaching and you're sort of trying to get them to confront that, to exist in that space, and that for a lot of people that's quite new and maybe not what they're expecting to go through as part of the cycle of coming to a coach.
Yeah, you need to work with what the client brings. You know, so it's not always, there's two forms of like, when I teach existential coaching, I think there's existential coaching and there's coaching that is informed by existential philosophy and knowledge. So if somebody comes to me and they want to do whatever, I might notice that there are certain concerns and paradoxes and that it might be useful for me, it's always useful for me to understand that so I can have more of an appreciation for who sits in front of me more holistically. But I might not put that on the table, so, oh, you have death anxiety. You know, that might be counterproductive. You know, but I might reflect back their relationship to endings in general, and if I see a pattern there. But only if I start seeing a pattern. So generally for me, my rule is if I hear something 3 times, I'll definitely point it out. And then the client can do something with that. Or we can at that point recontract whether we want to go into a deeper conversation about their relationship with endings, because that might just be the pattern that they need to explore in order to change those things that they want. But they might also just say, well, let's focus on some of this behavioral stuff because I just need to get this under control, because that is a longer conversation. You know, sometimes you just need to get things done before you go on a longer exploration. You know, and if you have something to offer, you always need to work with your client's goals. If something is not in between a client and their goal, then it's not really my place to put that on the table for them to explore, you know, to say, oh, what's that? It's like, that's not relevant. You know, only if that becomes relevant, if it keeps popping up. I'm like, this thing keeps popping up, what's that? You know, they might have not seen it, I might have seen it because I have this outside perspective and perhaps some of this understanding from science or from philosophy, that I'm able to see something that they don't see, you know, blind spots. That's what a coach is there for, really.
Who is your favorite existential writer?
I would say Sartre, because he's like there's Heidegger and Sartre. Heidegger is a piece of work because in the beginning I thought he's just making up words that don't exist. So I'm forced to really think about what he means, because it's a surefire way to take all of your assumptions away. You know, if I say absordance, and then I explain the concept, you really have to think about and follow me. If I say absurdity, you have an idea of what that means in your perspective. Then I realized actually Heidegger is a lot cleverer than that, and he went deep into the roots of the German language, and those words were created from that. It gave me a complete new appreciation for my own language, being German. You know, there's words and history of words that I've never started to think about. Certainly not at that level of depth. So that was very illuminating. That's why I love it. But I could, like, it was very painful trying to read it and make sense of it. And we talked about Lacan in that way. You need to work a paragraph so many times, and you might still not understand it. You know, and at some point you make more connections, and like, it took me a few years until some of those ideas really landed. Because sometimes you read something, then you have to experience something, and then you coach around it, and then you talk to some other people, and then you read it again, and you read some other people talking about it, and then you read somebody's readings of it, and then you comment. It's like, oh, that's what he meant 2 years later. Couldn't you have just said that? So that's part of my motivation, to translate some of this complex stuff and try to make it tangible and grounded in everyday experience. Because Heidegger's experience was being in a cabin and writing in the German Schwarzwald, like far from where things were going on. And then he became a roaring Nazi, which was very concerning. But like, it goes to show that like, just because you are a brilliant thinker and philosopher doesn't mean you can make very strange choices. You know, so for him that made sense on some level, which is concerning. But Sartre, on the other hand, was living the high life in Paris and like having sex with his students and being chased by a lobster while he was tripping on psychedelics. You know, he lived quite a life, and for me, I felt it was more attractive in terms of he was trying to get the most from it. You know, he was really enthusiastic in that way, to like really put people, to get them to think more deeply about stuff. You know, he was getting the most out of life, which I really respected. You know. So you want to do us?
Yes, mindfulness. Do you do it on your own, or do you also do it with your clients?
Depends. I always do it on my own, just to kind of ground myself, see if there's a couple of days ago, I just tuned into myself before the session, and I realized a conflict that I had 3 days ago was still with me. And I wasn't really aware of that. But I noticed I was still going over a dialogue in my head. It's like, oh wow, that's still there. That's interesting. And these kind of things, they can influence you. You know, how you react to things. How you're feeling right now, just to ground yourself. There's so much research into mindfulness now. It's phenomenal. The kind of benefits that lie in it. So, and sometimes I do it with my clients. For example, when somebody tunes into a coaching session and you see them still shaking around, it's like, oh, hey, how are you doing? It's like, oh yeah, I'm just looking for a room. Sorry, it's been a really busy day. And then I was like, okay, so what I want to work on is like, I invite you to just, you know, take a few breaths, arrive, you know, let's calm for a bit. You know, take your time, sit down. How about we take a minute and just breathe? You know, it's like, oh yeah, okay. And then we just breathe. Maybe I guide them through a breathing exercise for just 30 seconds or a minute or something. Just have them tune in with their senses. What can you hear? What can you see? Invite them to close their eyes, depending how receptive they are to it as well. Because some people, they was like, what? Close my eyes and do mindful? That's hippie shit. I don't want to. But if you talk about a focusing exercise or a grounding, or like, even if you just invite them to sit down and take a few deep breaths, you know, just to start focusing. You might present some mindfulness research and how good it is, and start every session with a mindfulness exercise. I think that would be really useful. And I know some coaches from the positive psychology masters where I taught, that they do that every single session, no matter what. Themselves and the other person as well. And they say it's phenomenal. It just changed the whole coaching.
It came to my mind because I go to anthroposophic doctor in Milan, so I tend to use more alternative medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And he won't, I don't know how you say it in English, measure the blood pressure. Is that okay? And he will first let you lie down for 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how stressed he see you coming into the room. And then he will sort of go on.
Yeah. When I was teaching...
No, it seems to me to be the same effect you can have on
When I was teaching in schools, I needed to kind of trick students into meditation sometimes, or into just calming down. So I kind of just made it a little game. For example, just feel your blood pressure, and that's already kind of a playful element. And then when they found it, they breathe in for 3, and they hold it for 3, and they breathe out for 3, and they hold it for 3, and it just gets them to breathe more slowly. And as they're breathing, the heart rate goes down, so they breathe even more slowly. You know, and it's like, it's playful, it's easy, most people can do that, and the results of just breathing are phenomenal. And we don't utilize it nearly enough.
I actually have a quite interesting story about that I found very interesting. I went to have my eyes tested, and they throw like a puff of air in your eye to test your pressure in the eye. So he did that about 3 times with me, and he said, I think you are suspect of glaucoma. So he checked me, I spent a lot of time like doing it again and again, and then I think the 4th or the 5th time, he said, can you relax? And so I thought, oh, I was going to breathe, my mindful breathing. And he was, it's gone. You have, it went from 23, I think was above the threshold, to 17 because of 30 seconds of breathing exercise, the pressure in the eye.
What you can do with your breath is phenomenal. There's a guy called Wim Hof who's done a lot of breath work. Holotropic breath work is something that helped my friend got to a result that he didn't have with 5 years of psychotherapy in 1 session of holotropic breath work. Holotropic. You get into like a trance of just breathing. You need to breathe. It's very exhausting. You need to breathe very heavily for a very long time, and you just oversaturate your body with so much oxygen that you get into this trance-like state. And there's like music as well. But like he connected with stuff from early in his childhood. His dad died quite early, and like a lot of stuff came out. It was very, very powerful. There's people who climb mountains in like low oxygen environments and negative degrees in their boxer shorts, you know, because they've learned these breathing techniques. It's phenomenal what the body can do.
Thank you. Shall we? I think you know, it's phenomenal what the body can do. Seems like a very nice place to end. Yannick, thank you very, very much.
I just wanted to make you aware that, like I said, I will happily send this around if you have any questions about any of these things. A lot of that stuff we mentioned, for example, the strength stuff, you know, mindfulness, meditation, that's what I wanted to show you, because I did write a little book on existential coaching and positive psychology. You can download them for free on my website. And that one's coming out in April, which is basically this one, massively beefed up and rewritten. That's coming out in April. You can buy that on Amazon, and I felt I should probably say that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.